What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch here, and I'm joined by Anthony. Anthony is a Vikings fan, and he is also a fellow YouTuber. You've seen him on a couple of our prediction videos early in this season. Wasn't able to keep him on because of schedule restrictions and stuff like that, but he is back here. He is here to talk about his Vikings. We're excited to have him on. Anthony, what's going on, bro? How you been doing? And then also just talk about the Vikings season this year, what you thought about them as a team, where you think they're going to go, and what you think their percentage is for going all the way.
All right. It's great to be back on. It's been too long, that's for sure. But I'm glad to be back on here talking about my Minnesota Vikings with a 13-3 season. I think the best part is looking at that. People might point to the Aaron Rodgers injury. Well, even if he wasn't injured, the Vikings still would have walked away with the division. And I just love that. This was such a fantastic season to me with the Minnesota Vikings. It's strange because I will look at a guy like Xavier Rhodes. I'm always nervous when I see him get hurt. But if I were to see a Case Keenum get hurt, love the guy. But I'm like, it's okay. You got Teddy behind him. Sam Bradford looks like he's coming back from IR. Like, I'm actually okay if the quarterback goes down. I think I'm the only fan that could say that of the 32 teams, that's just described how the Vikings season has been. It's been the next man up mentality, it seems like. Last year, they were just destroyed with injuries. This year, they've been more fortunate after the Bradford injury and Dalvin Cook injury early on. The only major one they've had is Nick Easton on the offensive line, and the offensive line has not been healthy throughout the season, but they've been able to put people here and there throughout it. So while it's definitely not 100%, I think this offensive line can get by without Nick Easton, and the running game without Dalvin Cook's actually been doing pretty good. I remember hearing people say the season's done once Dalvin Cook's out, but they've actually done a pretty good job. It's weird, seeing Adrian Peterson for a decade. You're used to seeing a guy just carry the running back load. In the last few years, since AP's been injured and for whatever other reasons, it's been more of a committee approach for running back. And it's actually worked pretty well this season, I think, for the first time really ever since AP hasn't been playing as much the last few years. Overall, I think they've done a really good job this season. Mike Zimmer is definitely a coach of the year candidate. I don't think he gets it. I think Sean McVay ultimately gets it. But it just tells you the fact you've got a coach of the year candidate. You have Case Keenum, who's definitely not going to be the MVP. But the fact that some people are even talking about him as an MVP when a year ago he barely got a spot into the Vikings, it's crazy. It's amazing. I remember after the bye week looking at the second half, and I felt like, I wouldn't predict it, but I felt the Vikings could win every game in the second half. I thought realistically they could go 5-3. They went 7-1. I think the Vikings are in a very good position as we get into the playoffs.
Yeah, broke it pretty much all the way down there. And I think the question everybody's asking, you touched on him a little bit. I think the biggest question with the Vikings, even though I don't have the question so much, I've been a Case Keenum guy all year, Anthony. What do you have to say about Case Keenum's performance, being a fan and watching them every single week, and just, do you think Case Keenum has enough to bring this Vikings team to the promised land?
I think so. I think this is the case. It seems like every year you have that guy who's like, I didn't expect him to do that well this season, and then kind of falls off. We've had Colin Kaepernick, RG3 over the years, who've had that really good season. I think that fits Case Keenum this year. When we talk about the offseason, I have a completely different story with Case Keenum. I'm not sure if the Vikings should bring him back, but for now, I think he's good enough to do it. We've seen a guy like Joe Flacco be elite in the playoffs. If Joe Flacco can do that, I think Case Keenum at least has a chance. Yeah,
especially with the same sort of built team. Good defense, good running game. So the Vikings, we'll see what they can do. But we're here to talk about the Saints as well. They play the New Orleans Saints. Minnesota Vikings, this is on Sunday. This is the prime time game on Sunday. So this is also the game that I think everybody is most looking forward to. My Patriots game doesn't really matter too much, I don't think, in the minds of people. I mean, it matters, but
yeah,
are people going to be really locked in on that one? The Eagles and the Falcons, it's kind of an interesting contest. And then also the Jacksonville-Pittsburgh one is intriguing because of what happened earlier in the season. But I think the Vikings and Saints, a lot of people had this game as the NFC Championship. So that's why it's so intriguing. You have a great offense versus a great defense. These teams did play this season. They played week number 1 in Monday Night Football. It's a lot different teams, sort of. No Dalvin Cook, no Sam Bradford for the Vikings, and no Adrian Peterson for the Saints. It's Alvin Kamara time, and it's a lot different has happened on their defense as well. So that week 1 performance, you can take something away from it, but I think you also have to look on the other side and be like, okay, these teams are very different, and they both play very different styles of ball than they did in week 1. But nonetheless, it was 29-19 for the Vikings in that game. Just going over some simple stats, the Vikings 7-1 at home. Saints 4-4 on the road this year. So they're not a great road team. They're very average, which is typically the Saints' way of doing things. They're very good inside their home building, but when it comes to going away, it's a different story for the Saints over the course of the Drew Brees, Sean Payton era. Also, you do have to keep into consideration that this is a Saints team that's also traveling to a dome, though. This is not an outside surface like it used to be in Minnesota. It's no snow. It's no rain. It's going to be perfect conditions. So that does help you if you are a Saints fan in regards to, okay, you're used to the dome conditions. This is also, I'd like maybe you to touch upon this a little bit, what your thoughts on. I've heard some people say this is a Bounty Gate rematch. It's not. I mean, it's like 10 years later. But like, what's your thoughts on that as a fan, having to go through the Bounty Gate, the Brett Favre interception, all that stuff?
That I started watching that game again the other day. I just haven't had the time to finish it. But I've looked. There's been articles, of course, people talking about it. I mean, in terms of the team, barely anybody's left. On the Vikings, it's only Brian Robinson. On the Saints, it's Drew Brees, of course, and their punter Thomas Morstan, I believe. Sean Payton, like one assistant coach for the Vikings, like barely anybody's left of that. So it's more of a thing for the fans. Like for me, I hate thinking about that game, and it's one of those things. It's kind of like death, when somebody dies, you have a really hard time with it. But as the years go by, it's easier and easier. That's kind of how I feel about this.
Yeah, and Anthony, I know that you're a Vikings fan, and you guys usually lose the big games. Like, let's just put it out there. But like, I've always said as a Patriots fan, I know I have a lot of wins, but also I always felt that losing the big games were a lot harder than going 2-14. You know what I mean? Like, this is just a side note before we even get into the game, but like losing the Super Bowl to the Giants hurt me more than if my team were to go 5-11. I think it's totally a lot worse. So for a Vikings fan, you guys have had to deal with that for years.
We've been on both sides. It was not too long ago where you had a 3-13 season, a 5-10-1 season. On the other hand, you lose by a field goal to the Falcons in the NFC Championship. You have Brett Favre throw that game-losing interception.
Also, question here. We got to answer this question. I have a Vikings fan that's a friend of mine that's a Vikings fan, and he always blames Brett Favre. But I always say, do you remember that Adrian Peterson had like 3 fumbles in that game?
I don't blame Brett Favre at all. I don't. It's one of those what most people don't remember. It was 3rd and 10. The Vikings call a timeout, have a 12-man on the field penalty. So they lose 5 yards from that. And I know we're like, why doesn't Brett Favre run? He's 40. Why would he run?
And he was getting killed.
Yeah. I just saw before we did this, he's having some big thing come out. He said he was concussed during the game. Like, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, so going to this game, I mean, that's in the past. This is today. This is 2018 now. Vikings are -5. The line has gone up. I think it started at 3.5. It's gone up to 5. So that's interesting. I thought that there would be more action on the Saints side because I think the Saints is more of a sort of a public team, and the people, they seem to like the Saints. But the Saints, just going over it, the Saints have lost 3 in a row on the road. And Brees, also, if you're a Vikings fan, this is good to take into account. Brees is 1-4 on the road in the playoffs. Usually he wins at home. And I do have a question for you as a Vikings fan before we break down Minnesota defense versus New Orleans offense and all that stuff. Are you going to get Adrian Peterson to blow the horn this week?
Oh,
that would be great, wouldn't it?
I wish. That'd be so much fun, but I'm sure since he's on the Cardinals, they're like, no. Maybe he should retire right now so he could come back and do that.
Yeah, that would be great because he had the whole New Orleans connection, and the whole like Monday Night Football game was built around, oh, it's the return of AP. But
Yeah.
no. So let's start off by talking about the Minnesota defense versus the New Orleans offense, which I think is the intriguing matchup for sure, because the Saints have one of the better offenses, more explosive offenses. They ripped up the Panthers last week, which they've ripped up the Panthers all year. Nobody really wants to talk about that. And then the Vikings defense is number one in the league statistically, and they're definitely one of the best defenses all around, secondary to their front seven in the NFL against the run, against the pass. Let's just start off with your take on, okay, what do the Vikings have to do? What's their X factor on defense? What do they have to do the best in order to win this game? And then who do they need to stop, for the Vikings to win?
I think it's twofold, the running game and Michael Thomas. I know Ted Ginn has that once every month big play like he did last week against the Panthers. But Michael Thomas, I'm not too worried about him because Xavier Rhodes just the last few years, he's done such a great job shutting down these top wide receivers. He did it earlier in the season when the Vikings played, and I don't think that'll be changing. What's changed to me a lot since that week 1 game is the running game. Without Adrian Peterson, really is the distraction he was. The running game's done very well the last 15 games. Last 16 games, I should say, for the Carolina Panthers, the New Orleans Saints since the Minnesota Vikings played them week 1. So that's probably my biggest worry when it comes down to it. I think the Vikings defensive line is just really good. I think it can slow down. And I mean, look at last week against the Panthers. They pretty much abandoned the running game. It did not accomplish much. I think the running game will at least be decent. I look back at the last loss the Vikings have against the Carolina Panthers. Cam Newton had a big play at the end of the game to put them in field goal range and ultimately win the game there. They got their touchdown. They won. So if they have those big plays, thing is, the Vikings have really cut down on those big plays. But I look back at the last playoff game the Vikings had against the Seattle Seahawks. That's what killed them. That was one of the biggest things that killed them. It's still in my mind of Russell Wilson letting the ball go back. And
Russell Wilson flukes.
Somehow.
It always happens with Russell Wilson.
Oh, I know. That's why he was like, 100% of the passing yards and 30% of the rushing yards this year for the Seahawks?
Yep.
It's crazy. Thank goodness Drew Brees can't do 30% of the running game.
When I look at this matchup, I see a Vikings defense that is overall, I've not been as big of a fan of the Panthers defense as a lot of people, specifically against the Saints. When it comes to the Vikings, I think they're a more well-rounded defense because they do have the pass rush that the Panthers have. I even may say that it's better, but they also have the secondary where they can actually match up with the Saints in more to man-to-man situations, and they can be physical at the line. And the Panthers, to me, they don't have those corners and they don't have those safeties that the Vikings have, and they're not able to really match up a lot man-to-man, which makes them play a lot of zone, which Drew Brees and Sean Payton can kind of just carve up. So I feel like with the Vikings, they can play more of aggressive man-to-man style, and it's just your guy versus my guy. And I think when the Vikings can do that in terms of the passing game, that's going to give them an advantage over to what the Panthers tried to do defensively, where they were able to get carved up in that facet of the game. When you're talking about the run game, something interesting for a lot of people, I know the Saints run game has probably been the best all year. But if you're a Saints fan, I think you have to be a little bit concerned, being that the Saints run game has been kind of wrapped up recently. And their last really efficient performance was in week 13 against the Panthers. I have the numbers here. Week 14, they only had 49 yards. Week 15, they had 108 yards against the Jets, which on a lot of attempts, 24 attempts. Week 16, they had 76 yards against Atlanta. Week 17, they only had 79 yards against Tampa Bay. And then the wild card, they only had 55 yards against Carolina. So I think that the running game recently for the Saints has kind of been a little bit slowed down by some teams. I wonder why that is. They played a lot of divisional opponents throughout that time. But when you're talking about the Vikings, they have the number 2 run defense. Carolina had the number 3 run defense. And I think that the Vikings can hold their own. The Saints might get a couple runs here and there, but I think they can hold their own for the most part in containing Kamara and Ingram.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think when I look at the strengths of the Vikings, I think when you talk about elite talent, it's there in the secondary. You have Xavier Rhodes and you have Harrison Smith. Those guys, I'm not the biggest pro football PFF
Focus
whatever.
guy?
Yeah,
Yeah.
pro football focus. There we go. But they had Harrison Smith as the highest rated player at any position. Take that as it is, whatever you think of that. But
I
think
like Pro Football Focus. I use them for some stuff and I don't use them for other stuff. You kind of have to take them with a grain of salt.
Yeah, it's that's the best way to put it.
Yeah.
So I like the Vikings secondary, and I think we look at last week. Drew Brees really stepped out in that game, and it looked like Drew Brees of old, where he just took over the game. I don't think I'm worrying too much about that. I think Xavier Rhodes will shut down Michael Thomas, which really hurts the receiving core there for the Saints. Then you got Harrison Smith to do whatever Harrison Smith wants in terms of the other receivers. I think the running game, like you said, has been really good for the Vikings this year. And Everson Griffin's done a good job. He's double-digit sacks again this year. I'm liking the Vikings stopping the run. And if you could stop the run and slow down the passing game, that's a huge part of the game right there.
Yeah, for sure. And you brought up Drew Brees, how well he's playing in this last 5 games, 284 yards per game. That's pretty good. I think that would have been around what Tom Brady's regular season numbers were for the course of the season. So that would have led the league in the NFL. Of course, he had the percentage record this season, which he beat Sam Bradford's, which all the Vikings fans are rattled about. Of course, yeah, Michael Thomas, Kamara, and Ingram. The other thing is Kamara in the passing game. I think that if there's a team that can really slow Kamara down in terms of that, I think the Panthers did a decent job in the game last week, but like with Luke Kuechly and those guys. What do you think that the Vikings game plan will be? Do you think that they'll kind of like match up Harrison Smith with him, or do you think it's going to be like Eric Kendricks or
probably Kendricks Barr? They'll probably give that one more to the linebackers. I guess it depends on how the game goes. I mean, last week it was a passing game. It seems like most of the Saints season, though, it's been a running game. If it looks more passing, they'll probably have Harrison do that. If it's not, he'll go up and make the tackles in the running game.
Yeah. You brought up Xavier Rhodes against Michael Thomas. The first matchup, they did line up against each other, 5 catches for 45 yards for Michael Thomas. So he wasn't doing a ton of damage in that game. I'd expect that matchup to be big. And then also, what's your thoughts on Trey Waynes this year and Terrence Newman and the other corners around Xavier?
It's interesting because I'd say in the middle portion of the season, I was like, not too impressed. But as I look back at the season, Trey Waynes, he's had some good moments in this season. And this is his 3rd year now in the league. I think he stepped up. I don't know what I think of him. I always go back to I wanted Marcus Peters over Trey Waynes, and you look at the 2 careers of them. But Trey Waynes has done a good job. I still kind of think the Vikings may want to look at cornerback early in the draft because, in terms of weaknesses, there's not a lot on this team, so I'm okay addressing that. But he's done a good job. Really, in general, the cornerbacks, the depth has been good this year, which last year kind of lacked.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And the Vikings, they have sort of the same corners they had last year. It's just they've played a little bit better, and their defense as a whole has been a little bit more healthier. And I think the matchups to watch besides that is, can the Saints take advantage of those players? Because Rhodes is going to be great, but can the Saints with Ted Ginn and Brandon Coleman and what's the other guy's name? The slot receiver, Snead. Can they make plays against Newman and against Waynes? Can they kind of make those plays? So that's going to be a big thing. And can Drew Brees kind of pass the ball? Because as we said, I think it's going to be tougher for the Saints to run it consistently. So it's going to be on Drew Brees to make plays on that side of the ball. And this is also just to bring it up. This is also going to be really fun on this side of the ball because it's Sean Payton versus Mike Zimmer. And what have you thought about that, what's your thoughts on that coaching matchup? And then also Mike Zimmer as your coach, what's your thoughts on Zimmer?
Zimmer, he's done a really good job. I think you look at what he's done because let's compare it to the last time the Vikings and Saints were in the match, played each other in the playoffs. Brad Childress, who looks like his time in the NFL's come to an end. He's retiring. But the next year he got fired. I was thinking about this the other day. Even if the Vikings have a poor season next year, I just can't see a situation in which Zimmer's fired. He's done such a good job. The Viking fans love him. I really enjoyed him as an NFL head coach. He's done what I look at in particular, when you bring in a new head coach, if they can fix their side of the ball, they're doing the right thing. The Vikings came in, they were the 31st defense in the NFL the first year Zimmer came in, or the right before he came in, I should say.
Man, I don't even remember them being that bad. Like,
yeah, it's crazy because that first year he brought them to, I think, like 17. They were middle of the pack, and I mean, you had about the same players there. I think the only real addition was Anthony Barr. So he's done a really good job, especially considering the last guy, Leslie Frazier, was a defensive mind. He's done a lot better than that last defensive mind. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So then going over to the opposite side of the ball, you have Minnesota's offense versus New Orleans defense. New Orleans defense, to me, didn't look too great against the Panthers. To me, it was a lot of Cam Newton making all the plays for the Panthers, and that's kind of been the case. And to me, again, in my opinion, I think the Vikings offense overall is a lot more talented than the Panthers offense. I mean, besides Cam making the plays with his feet and his arm, and then maybe McCaffrey out of the backfield and Greg Olsen, for Minnesota, you have a solid run game, you have a good offensive line, and you have two stud receivers with a pretty good tight end. Mm-hmm. What do you see in terms of this side of the ball that you think the Vikings can take advantage of? And what have you been happy about in terms of their offensive performance this year?
Well, in terms of their offense this year, Adam Thielen, I think a lot of Viking fans came in hoping and assuming he'd have a good year, and he really blew it out of the water, over 1,200 receiving yards, going from a guy who had to go to all these lengths just to even have a chance to be on the 90-man roster. And now he's one of the best wide receivers in the league. He's really stepped it up. And Stephon Diggs, coming into this year and last year, many people assumed he'd be the number one, but Adam Thielen's really become that guy. Marshawn Lattimore against them. The nice thing where the Vikings are in this position, I look at the Saints. You can take Michael Thomas out of the game, and that changes the game.
Yeah.
Vikings don't have that. If you take out Adam Thielen, you still have to worry about Stephon Diggs and Kyle Rudolph, which is a huge advantage there.
Yeah, I agree. And I've been talking about this all week when we did our predictions as like a group. Is like Lattimore going to cover Diggs, or is he going to cover Thielen? And then who's going to cover Diggs if Thielen's covered, and who's going to cover, you know what I mean? So like, it's just all the different weapons. When even last week for the Panthers, they really only have one receiver, Funchess, that's any good. Like, he's not even on the level of these guys, but he's the only receiver. Like, who are you going to cover? Clay? Like, I don't know. So like Lattimore, who's he going to take? And then that's probably where Minnesota will shift their attention to the other side. Will they go with, giving the ball to Diggs? And then Rudolph, seeing how Greg Olsen had success last week, Rudolph may be successful this week. What's your thoughts on Kyle Rudolph this year?
He's done pretty good. I mean, last year he did really well. This year, compared to that, not as well, but he's done a pretty good job. He's the reliable red zone target, and especially in the second half is where he really got a lot of his touchdowns. He's that, you always talk about how a quarterback has to have that safety blanket and the tight end, and I think he does his job as that safety blanket pretty well for Case Keenum.
Yeah, speaking about Case Keenum, this is his first ever playoff game. Mm-hmm. He is playing versus a secondary who led the NFC in interceptions this year, and they're also third in sacks. So if there's a team that is going to kind of force those mistakes out of Case Keenum, it could be the Saints. I'm not going to say it's going to be, but it could be the Saints. In terms of just like keeping the ball and turnovers and being safe with the ball, do you have confidence in Case Keenum in that regard?
I think I do. There's that once Teddy came back, he was kind of throwing more interceptions than you'd like, and that's why Viking fans kept it going. Like, hey, maybe it's time for Teddy to step in. But then he started to do it less, and his turnovers, we haven't seen it as much. I think he finished the season with only 7 interceptions, so he did a pretty good job there. I definitely am worried when it comes to that. Like I mentioned earlier, it's nice to have two really good wide receivers. If I had to guess, I'd say they probably shadow Diggs more. So that keeps Adam Thielen
That
open.
was my guess as well.
Because it seems like as I look back this season, Diggs kind of had a quiet second half because for some reason, the teams picked him
and
over
I feel
Thielen.
that the reason because of that is because I feel like Adam Thielen plays a little bit more in the slot, and it's just more difficult for teams to put their number one corner on a guy that moves so many different places when Stephon Diggs kind of just plays on the outside. So you can just put your outside number one corner on him, and then with Thielen, he moves everywhere. So it's hard to kind of track him,
Yeah, I'd agree on that. I think that's really what we've seen happen this season. Because like I said, Diggs kind of compared to Thielen had a quiet second half. But even Thielen, not that he was bad, but like in the last few games, he just didn't have as many yards as you would have wanted. But I don't think that's a super big concern, but it's something to think about at least.
Week one, just talking about week one, Sam Bradford, of course, at quarterback he went off. He had maybe his best game of his entire career. He had 346 yards. He was 84% completion percentage, which is just mind boggling. And then he had 3 touchdowns. Dalvin Cook also played in week one. He had 127 yards. Just talking about that, Case Keenum, I think could have, I'm not going to say 346 yards and all that, but I think he could have some success throwing the ball in this game. Like we said, I think there's matchups that favor them. And then in terms of the run game, do you have the same confidence that they're going to be able to run the ball against the Saints run defense? That's been pretty solid overall, with those guys in the front that they did in the first week. Do you think, Latavius Murray, Jerick McKinnon, those guys, I see Jerick McKinnon as he might do the same things that Christian McCaffrey did, because he's a good receiver and stuff. And, McCaffrey had that big play. Do you think that, especially Murray, do you think they're going to have success against this defense?
I don't think we're going to see this like a super great rushing game by either of them, but I think it will do a good job. I think when the Vikings need to run it, if they have a lead in the fourth quarter and they need to run it, I think they could get a first down or two before they have to punt or kick. Latavius Murray, in the later portion of the season, has kind of separated from Jerick McKinnon. It's definitely not his show. But you feel more confident to just give him the more carries and he can get the job done. I like how Latavius Murray's been doing, and Jerick McKinnon, it's nice to have him be that change of pace guy. It seemed like for a while they were kind of switching between who had a good game. One guy would get 100 yards, the other guy would get 100 yards the week after. And I think as a passing threat, Jerick McKinnon's definitely more of the passing threat than Latavius Murray, how it's been this season. But in any regard, I think the running game could do a decent enough job. It can get the job done at least.
All right. And just the last note, I wanted to know, what's the update on the offensive line? I know there's some injuries and question marks, and I even heard that they might move Ramers to guard. So, what's your thoughts on the offensive line, and what's the update there?
I think we'll see Jeremiah Searles take over like it's been. I like Rashad Hill, and that's kind of why they want to do it. I think he's probably going to be the tackle of the future. And actually, what you mentioned about moving Remmers to guard, I heard that's something they're considering once the season's over. And depending on how it goes, they might even do it this season. It just kind of depends on how it is. This is this is the first game where we'll see Jeremiah Searles as the starter, not the temporary guy. He'd like the starter. So he's done not as good as Hill when he has had to step in, but he's still done a good job. I can't complain about how Jeremiah Searles has done this year. Okay,
so that was one of the big kind of question marks that I had. All right, so let's give our predictions. Anthony, what's your prediction for this game? I'm guessing you're going Vikings. Tell me why the Vikings are going to win, and then also give me a score.
Yeah, it was hard. I don't like picking the Vikings in the playoffs because it's like I'm just waiting for them to upset. I do have to pick them, and I am picking them this week against the Saints. It'd be great to see that win against New Orleans, but beyond even that, I think at the end of the day, I look at the two sides of the ball. I think the defense can do a good job slowing down the Saints offense, which has been huge this season. But let's give credit where credit's due. The Saints defense has been really good too. But when I think you compare it, I think the Saints offense is better than the Vikings, and the Vikings defense is better than the Saints defense. But then when you compare it the other way around, I think the Vikings have the advantage. I'll take the Vikings. I'll take them 27-20.
All right. Good score, good differential. Mine was very similar. I have the Vikings winning as well. I agree with a lot of what you said. I just think I looked at it, even I know that it was a lot different week one, but I think the same sort of things are going to play out. I think the Vikings, they're at home, huge. Second thing, I think they'll be able to get a little bit of pressure on Breeze. Andrews Pete, we didn't mention this. Andrews Pete is also out for the year for the Saints. That's big. I think that they'll be able to get a little bit of pressure, and I think Rhodes will kind of slow down Thomas, and their run game will be slowed down. It'll be on Drew Brees and those other guys to make plays, and I think the Vikings defense will do a good job there. And then offensively, I think Case Keenum's going to have a good game. I think, your run game will maybe score a couple touchdowns or whatever and move the chains a little bit, but I think that Case Keenum is going to be the guy to make most of the plays with your receivers. So I have the Vikings winning 24-17, the same differential, 7 points. But I think this is going to be a good game. I think it's going to be entertaining. And, all the way through, I think it could go either way. I wouldn't blame somebody for taking the Saints. I just, like you said, I think it's more of when you compare both sides of the ball and you compare the matchups, I think the Vikings have the advantage.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think week one's definitely something you need. Like, I know a lot of Viking fans want to be like, week one, we should be fine. I think week one's worth looking at, but let's not act like it was this past month. Like, it's been a while. A lot's changed for both teams.
For sure. So we both have the Vikings advancing to the NFC Championship. Just a quick question. Who would you rather play?
In the NFC Championship, probably Atlanta, because you'd be hosting them. The Vikings played them this season 14-9, and that was in Atlanta. So if they can beat them 14-9 just a couple months ago, I think they can do the same thing in Minnesota.
All right, that's actually my same answer. I feel like a lot of people would rather play the Eagles, but I think that the Atlanta and being at home would be big for the Vikings.
Oh, I do too. They had a little road stretch for a while. That was hard to get through. So to play home, especially in the NFC Championship, I'll take that.
All right, Anthony, anything that you want to plug, your YouTube or Twitter or whatever, and then we'll say goodbye.
Oh, yeah. I have my channel, Fairview Entertainment Network. My predictions, I think I haven't made them yet, so they'll probably be out tomorrow. And you can
better be taking the Patriots, Anthony.
Oh, I would not pick the Titans. I've been so low on the Titans this year. The fact they made the playoffs, I wanted your Chargers to make the playoffs. I was mad about that.
They should have.
I was so mad about that one.
They were way better than the Titans, too. I still think that if the Chargers were in the playoffs, they would be a harder game for the Patriots.
Oh, I agree. They're much better. But it kind of sucks for the Titans fans because now instead of getting a Josh McDaniels, they're going to be stuck with Mike Mularkey. Hope that playoff win was worth it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for joining us here on the Bottom Line View. It's Mitch and Anthony. If you guys enjoyed, hit the like button, subscribe, and go subscribe to Fairview Entertainment over there on YouTube, and follow Anthony as well. He does some good NFL content over there, so go check him out. All right, guys, it's Mitch. Peace out.
See you guys.